Byline Audio.
Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Day of Reckoning, how the far right declared war on democracy. That's the title of a new book by Mike Wendling. It explores how even after the January the 6th insurrection, conspiracy theories and violent racist ideologies have continued to flourish, not just on the internet, but have filtered into the US political mainstream. It's a story of oath keepers, proud boys, vaccine deniers, even those who think that QAnon should go on and on. Before we talk to Mike, just a reminder to check out bylineaudio.com. It's our new offering where you can find a fantastic stable of fresh podcasts, including Spare Your Blushes Vicar, Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and Americana with Bonnie Greer and Hardeep Matharo. So do check that out over at bylineaudio.com. So let's welcome Mike Wendling then to the Byline podcast. And Mike, you and I met a few years ago at the BBC in London. So full declaration, we are friends, former colleagues. So for people who aren't aware of your work, please just set out your credentials.
Oh, well, Adrian, like you say, we used to work together on all sorts of investigative stories, scams from the world of technology and online dating and cryptocurrency. Heady times. Actually, that sort of set me on the path of researching the online far right, but extremism more generally, conspiracy theories. I've worked at the BBC since then, particularly for a unit called BBC Trending, which covered the world of social media. All these things seemed to come together around 2015 when Donald Trump first declared that he was going to run for president. And we had the rise of the alt-right, these fringe, heavily online white nationalists and hardcore conservatives. As I've explored in this book, that movement has kind of morphed. It's become more paranoid, it's become less playful, and some elements have become a lot more hardcore. Donald Trump is running for president for the third time, and this fringe movement is coalescing around their candidate once again and trying to influence the election that's coming up here in the US in November.
Yeah, and you'd call it a fringe movement, or maybe a series of interconnected fringe movements, maybe more accurate based on a reading of your book. But I think my key takeaway is that although many of these voices are on the fringe, we are really talking about a generational shift in politics, in the sense that what would have been regarded as extreme voices have now very much become mainstream voices, particularly within the Republican Party.
Absolutely. And, Donald Trump is now the leader of the Republican Party, the de facto leader, but his campaign has the ties to some of these trollish elements, to some of the more extreme elements, if you sort of drill down to people who are involved in his campaign. And of course, when we talk about conspiracy theories, there's one that's really driving his campaign, really motivating him. And that's the conspiracy theory that there was vast voter fraud that swung the 2020 US presidential election. He continues to talk about this all the time. His supporters are very enthralled with it. And you're right, they aren't necessarily on the fringe. If you go to Trump rallies, I actually went to my very first actual Trump rally where he was there a few weeks ago. You see these things are baked in. You see signs of them everywhere. And he mentions these things when he's on stage.
You mention in the book a film called 2000 Mules, and this carries the idea that the vote was stolen in the last US presidential election. And perhaps in the UK, you think, well, there was this moment on January the 6th, this attempted insurrection that was put down, and that's the end of the matter. But a film like 2000 Mules spreads the word, spreads the propaganda. Tell us a little bit more about that movie.
Yeah. So, like all good conspiracy theories, it uses a grain of fact, right? So, some researchers, a partisan group, collected a whole bunch of phone records. They found that many people were both passing by areas that had not-for-profits, usually, sympathetic or aligned with the Democratic Party, and Democratic Party ideals and candidates. And that those same people, those same sort of data points, were also traveling by ballot drop boxes. To explain that a little bit, this is a relatively new phenomenon, mostly driven by the pandemic in the United States, where the ability to vote absentee, to vote by mail, to vote by post, rather, was rapidly expanded because of the fear of spreading the coronavirus. Now, if you overlay maps of where these ballot drop boxes are, where not for profits are, they tend to be in the same places. And that's because they tend to be in cities, in densely populated urban places.
And when we say not for profits, we're talking about non-governmental organizations that might be identified as progressive, as left-wing in the eyes of the Republicans. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Activist groups, community groups, but definitely from that side of the political spectrum for sure. From those seeds of fact, the researchers and the organization that the film 2000 Mules greatly relies on spun a web of conspiracy, really, and allegations that went well beyond anything that has been proven, went well beyond any sort of thing that a journalist, and much less a court, would consider as evidence to support Donald Trump's claims of this stolen or rigged election. The film goes on for an hour and a half, and there is only one real credible story of alleged vote fraud that I found in there. And remarkably, it came in a county where Donald Trump actually increased the share of his vote in 2020. So if there was all this vote rigging and fraud going on, it would seem to have an effect the opposite from the one intended.
Indeed, but that doesn't stop those who believe in what is called the big lie now from believing it. But this is just to focus on the kind of the odd bit of the conspiracy. Then you've got phone records showing that people moved past these mail centers to where NGOs were based, these not-for-profits, then moved back again towards where the drops were situated. And around this is spun the conspiracy.
Absolutely. And you can follow some of these data points, these people with phones, and you can see that they're making multiple trips per day. Now, what else went skyrocket during the pandemic, right? Home delivery. And there's no telling, because these data points are anonymized, whether those people making those trips stopped at the Dropbox or the non-for-profit, or whether they were Amazon delivery drivers. It's a very sort of tenuous string to hang this conspiracy on. The film goes into some more detail about video that was picked up outside of Dropboxes and people, putting multiple ballots in. In most cases, these have been investigated in the family and friends and acquaintances or whatnot. There is a perfectly legal form of collecting ballots called ballot harvesting. In some cases, actually, not-for-profits can help, but this is generally for, say, the elderly, if people can't get around very well, and somebody will say, I'm going to help you vote. Let me just pick up your vote from home. The actual incidents, and goes across the political spectrum, right? So right-wing think tanks and left-wing think tanks have looked into this. Actual instance of voter fraud that's been found out, prosecuted, or led to a guilty plea or whatever in court. It does happen, but it's vanishingly small. We are talking like fractions of a percent. Voting security and the patchwork system that we have here in the United States is probably something to be concerned about. A lot of this stuff is online. It comes from different systems. A lot of the time, it's not very well funded in terms of ballot security. But when we talk about these wild conspiracy theories and the lack of evidence that Donald Trump was adversely affected because of these kinds of tactics, in some ways, it distracts from, potentially a legitimate issue.
Yeah, I only mentioned 2000 Mules because I found it a fascinating chapter. And in 2022, it was the second largest grossing documentary in the United States, behind Moon Age Daydream, a documentary about David Bowie. So it just exemplifies how widespread and how mainstream some of these ideas have become.
Absolutely. It found an audience because there was already an existing audience out there, very receptive to these kinds of ideas. And we don't know that everybody who saw the film completely bought it. I'm sure that many people didn't or were skeptical. But you're right. It shows the sort of mainstreaming of these ideas. It's certainly not confined to the fringes anymore. It's a key part of Donald Trump's campaign. And I guess the sort of more conspiratorial and aggressive side of his supporters has in the past driven his campaign and driven some of the issues that he talks about. And we're seeing it again. There's multiple examples already, the early stages here, and not a whole lot of Americans are really sort of paying attention. But in terms of his speeches and the rhetoric that he uses about immigrants, the kinds of tactics and the video that he put up the other day that mentions the unified Reich and the people behind that video and the kind of content that they're putting out, you can kind of see these themes repeat again and again.
Not everybody is as overt as the Iowa Republicans, but the Iowa Republicans merit a chunk of your book as well, aren't you? These are a group who don't believe that being born in the United States would necessarily qualify you for citizenship. They're down on abortion rights, for example. How significant would a group like that be, really, in the Republican Party if Trump won the presidency?
Very significant. I mean, those things are now pretty mainstream in the Republican Party. I picked out Iowa simply because, I'm here in Chicago, I'm in the Midwest. Iowa is where the presidential campaigns start in the US. And so it has a very particular place in American politics. And traditionally, I've been to the state many times over the years and a lot recently. Traditionally, it's kind of seen as moderate for both parties. You know what I mean? This is not a place where you're going to find huge Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, there will be some. Also, you're not going to find protests from the right wing or extremist groups, really. Traditionally, that's been the case. But recently, I have noticed this pattern. There's a few stories in the book from Iowa of people who are buying into these conspiracy theories. The Republican Party platform in the state, as you mentioned, is pretty strident. And you know what? I don't know if that's necessarily that Iowa is driving anything. It's more the general gist of the Republican Party at large and how it's being captured by some of these pro-Trump forces, and about how those fringes, the conspiratorial or paranoid fringes, are moving into the mainstream. You can see this pretty much anywhere. It just so happens that Iowa, being right in the middle of the country, is a good place to go and find it.
You examine the proliferation of conspiracy theories on the internet, Mike, and if they stayed on the internet, I suppose that would be one thing, wouldn't it? And QAnon was a classic example of that. The pizza restaurant at which children were allegedly being abused. I mean, there is a pizza restaurant, isn't there? But there was no
Right.
basement at which children were being abused. So one of the core stories of QAnon was debunked ages ago, but
Yeah.
QAnon continues. And I just find that baffling and disturbing. You talk about the way in which people excuse murder in the book, and it's this jump from the internet to real life. What happens on the internet doesn't stay on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it is a range of behaviors. You have sort of highlighted the extreme end. And of course, there have been murders linked to QAnon, there have been violent acts. The QAnon supporters were out in force at the Capitol riot in January 2021. But then there's a more sort of diffuse belief set, right? Which supports that. It's not at all quarantined or isolated. So, the beliefs of QAnon that children are under threat, that there's pedophiles running through the elites, and usually by elites, people mean the Democratic Party or the government or the power structure. Those ideas have become more diffuse. They don't necessarily rely on this crazy sort of QAnon code speak. If you've ever seen sort of like what's called Q drops, the messages from Q, the figurehead, they're very hard to understand and figure out. But people don't go directly to that kind of stuff, and it's not being pumped out in large quantities anymore. What's happening is that sort of general idea of threat. Pops up everywhere. It pops up in not only in Iowa, in suburban Pennsylvania. You'll find people waving Q flags at Trump rallies or outside his resort in Florida, as I saw when he was coming back to Mar-a-Lago resort after his first indictment. So it's really becoming very broad and certainly no longer dependent on the internet. And it's no longer quarantined on the internet. It has also lost a little bit of the sort of irony. A lot of the people who were sort of spreading the Pizzagate stuff were not entirely serious about it.
Which, for those who don't know, is one of the founding myths of QAnon.
Yeah, yeah. Or I suppose maybe the right way to describe it is QAnon rose out of the ashes of Pizzagate shortly thereafter. This conspiracy about a pizza place in Washington where there was children being locked up. But around that time, and that was late 2016, there was a lot of, I suppose, energy around the election of Donald Trump, and a lot of people were simply not buying into it, but seeing that it had real political power, and they thought that by posting sort of crazy memes online, that they were sort of not necessarily celebrating, but continuing what their action that had happened during that pretty fractious campaign year. A lot of that fun-loving spirit, if you can call it that, is completely absent from this new breed of people, and really the conspiracy and the paranoia have completely overwhelmed them.
How ready do you think this fringe, which has become mainstream, is likely to resort to violence?
It's obviously a really important question. The flashpoint is obviously going to be the election in early November here. In some ways, the structures and some of the groups and the organizing vectors that people had that resulted in the violence at the Capitol in 2021 have broken down. So they are less effective and they have fewer organized groups. The Proud Boys are in disarray, although they have survived. Other militia groups have disappeared. The Oath Keepers, for instance, when their leader, Stuart Rhodes, went to prison for the riot. On the other hand, the energy is still there. So I think that maybe a repeat of something like the storming of the Capitol is perhaps unlikely. The potential for some sort of violence is definitely acute. And I think it probably keeps up the counterterror authorities, the law enforcement authorities here in the US, and not just the ones in Washington. The swing states that will decide the election are all over the country. And you see these fractious battles in Michigan or Arizona, and people harassing election officials has become a common thing around elections now. What happens and where it might happen is very, very difficult to predict. But certainly, people will be on a knife edge as we move to November.
Talking of January the 6th, you meet the son of Stuart Rhodes, who did a runner from his dad. That's quite a strange and moving story in its way.
Dakota was just such a self-possessed, very clear-eyed young man, which is remarkable because he grew up in this environment where his father was running one of the premier militias in the whole United States, one of the key organizing groups that sent dozens and dozens of people to the Capitol riot. He saw the writing on the wall as a teenager. I spend a lot of time with Dakota in Montana, where he still lives, and where he's actually mounting a political campaign this fall. He's running for the Montana State House. Yeah, the sort of courage that he had to escape to save his family from what he describes as a very abusive household was quite astonishing. I always think that when we're talking about sort of the extremes and the violence, there are people out there who are like him, like Tanya Gersh, who lives in the same area and who stood up to neo-Nazis marching through her town. Those are just a couple of stories. There's countless other ones that I have encountered. So, there are people who are willing to stand up for democracy, really, lots of them. And while I'm concentrating in this book about the far right, I also sort of encourage people on different sides of the political spectrum to look at the positive things. American politics has always been messy, right? And actually, it's always been violent. Violence is very common in American politics, even recently, certainly even in the years before the Capitol riot. But somehow it kind of trundles along. People do sort of stand up against the people who want to commit violence to advance their agendas. It's not all dark.
My colleague who writes for the Byline Times, Heidi Sigmund Kuda, runs a Substack as well, which I would advise listeners to check out. But one of Heidi's big insights has been the role of Russian disinformation in the United States. She name checks Mike Flynn, the former defense secretary under Donald Trump. There's not much in your book about Russian disinformation. Is that because you think that isn't an issue, that the psyops of the Russian state are not a factor in influencing some of these activities? Or is that just not what you were encountering as you moved around the States?
It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I can't say too much about it, but I'm working on a story about a Russian disinformation op that is actually being run by an expat, or there's a involvement of Western expats in this operation. Yeah, I should probably stop saying it then, but it's going to be out in the next couple of weeks.
Clearly, then, you don't think this is not an issue.
No, it's definitely an issue. It's definitely an issue. I think there's a timing issue, which is this. We see a lot of the disinformation networks, and experts who study this 24/7 tell me this too. Russian disinformation was very focused on the war in Ukraine, recently has changed tack, and they're increasingly focused on the US election. So this is a pretty recent development post, the writing of the book. It will be a factor. The other thing, though, I would say, though, is that Russian ops and foreign ops of all sorts, tend to ride the wave. In other words, they don't create QAnon. What they do is they amplify QAnon. There's no better spreaders of this kind of stuff than actual homegrown Americans. And that's real people, and that's bot accounts, or, anonymous accounts or pseudonymous accounts. The Russian operations tend to jump in and pump this stuff out once it really gets going. But a lot of the themes and a lot of the stories are homegrown.
Mike, thanks for joining us. The book is out at Pluto Press. It is called Day of Reckoning, How the Far Right Declared War on Democracy, and it is by Mike Wendling. Thank you. If you want to support the work of this podcast, by the way, can I recommend that you take out a subscription to the Byline Times? It's our fantastic monthly newspaper, as enjoyed by Mike Wendling, I believe. And is that right, Mike? Yes. And
I'm a fan.
He's a fan. Check it out. Do take out a subscription. Head over to bylinetimes.com. If you get the monthly newspaper, you'll get the best of our online offerings, but you'll also be able to read content that you can't see anywhere else. And do check out our new podcast offering as well at bylineaudio.com. This has been a We Bring Audio production for Byline Audio, made in Birmingham. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, cheers. Bye-bye.